Professor Eleanor Walsh leaned closer to the monitor, adjusting her glasses as she scrutinized the digitized photograph. The image, a daguerreotype from 1861, showed a busy New York street scene, horse-drawn carriages, women in hoop skirts, men in top hats. But there, near the edge of the frame, stood a figure that made no sense. "James, come look at this," she called to her research assistant without taking her eyes off the screen. James Chen set down his coffee and joined her at the workstation in the Columbia University archives. "What am I looking at?" "This man," Eleanor pointed to a figure partially obscured by the crowd. "Look at his clothing." The man wore what appeared to be a modern blazer, slim-fit pants, and what could only be described as contemporary eyeglasses. He stood with hands in pockets, looking directly at the camera with an expression of mild confusion. "That's impossible," James whispered. "The photos authenticated." "Multiple times," Eleanor nodded. "Discovered in a collection donated by the Astor family in 1923. Chemical analysis confirms the dating. This isn't a manipulation or a double exposure." James zoomed in, examining the details. His clothes, the glasses, they looked like something from the 1960s at the earliest, not 1861. "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "And there's more." She clicked to another image, the same photo but enhanced and enlarged. "Look at his wrist." James squinted. "Is that a watch?" "Digital from the look of it." The silence between them grew heavy, with implications neither wanted to voice. "We need to keep this quiet until we understand what we're looking at," Eleanor finally said. "Start with the historical records. Find out who was taking photographs at this location in 1861. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat in her apartment overlooking Morningside Heights, the city lights glimmering beyond her window as she scrolled through the digitized photo again and again. Something about the man's expression haunted her, a look of bewilderment and fear, as though he had no idea how he'd ended up in that moment. Her phone rang, startling her. "Professor Walsh." James's voice sounded strained. "I found something. The photographer was Jonathan Pierce. He died 3 days after taking this photograph. Cause of death? That's just it. The official record says shock and distress following an unexplained event. His journal was donated to the New York Historical Society. The last entry mentions a man who appeared from nowhere and spoke of things that cannot be." Eleanor felt a chill run through her body. "James, I need you to find everything you can about Jonathan Pierce and see if there's any record of the man in the photo." "Already on it," James replied. "But Professor, what if we're looking at something that science can't explain?" "Science can explain everything," Eleanor said firmly. "We just haven't found the right explanation yet." But as she hung up, Eleanor wasn't sure she believed her own words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling her windows as though something was trying to get in, or perhaps warning her to stop looking. The New York Historical Society's reading room was quiet, save for the gentle hum of climate control systems protecting the delicate documents. Eleanor handled Jonathan Pierce's journal with gloved hands, carefully turning pages that hadn't been read in decades. The journal itself was unremarkable, leather-bound, well-used, filled with neat handwriting detailing the photographer's daily business and occasional personal reflections, until the final entries. October 17th, 1861. "Today, I witnessed something I cannot explain. While photographing on Broadway, a disturbance occurred. Not a sound, so much as a ripple in the air itself. And then he was simply there, a man dressed in the strangest fashion, appearing as if stepping through an invisible door. The crowd barely noticed, but I saw it all through my lens. When our eyes met, his filled with terror. 'What year is it?' he asked me. When I told him, he began to weep." October 18th, 1861. "The man, who calls himself Robert Ilias, came to my studio today. His claims are impossible. that he is from the year 1965, that he was walking home from work when the world around him shifted. Yet he knows things, describes inventions and events that sound like something from Mr. Verne's fantastical stories. I find I cannot disbelieve him entirely. October 19th, 1861. Robert grows increasingly distressed. He fears he's losing his mind, yet shows me strange objects from his pockets. A credit card made of hard material, unlike any I've seen. Coins with impossible dates. I have agreed to help him, though I know not how. The final entry, dated October 20th, sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. Robert disappeared today in the same manner he arrived. A shimmering in the air, a look of horror on his face, and then emptiness where he stood. I fear what this means. I fear I have glimpsed something mankind was not meant to see. I can no longer trust my own senses or the nature of reality itself. Pierce had died the following day. Professor, James's voice broke her concentration. I found city records for a Robert Elias. Eleanor looked up. From 1861. No, James said, sliding a folder across the table. From 1965. He was reported missing on October 15th, 1965. Never found. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a missing person report and a black and white photograph of a man. The same man from the 1861 photograph. This is impossible, she whispered. There's more, James said. I found another photograph taken in 1965, just days before Elias disappeared. He placed another image on the table. A crowd at what appeared to be a political rally. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable once spotted, was a bearded man in 1860s attire. Next to him, a woman in period dress. Jonathan Pierce and his wife, James explained. I cross-referenced with their portraits. Eleanor stared at the photo. Are you suggesting that both men were displaced in time? That Pierce somehow followed Elias? I'm not suggesting anything, James said carefully. I'm just showing you what I found. Eleanor sat back, mind racing. We need to find out if there were any other incidents, any other misplaced people. As they packed up their materials, neither noticed the elderly man watching them from across the reading room, his gnarled hands gripping a cane, his eyes never leaving the journal they'd been examining. Outside, the October sky had darkened prematurely, heavy clouds rolling in from the east. As they walked back toward campus, Eleanor felt a strange sensation, as though they were being followed. James, she said quietly, don't look back. But I think someone is watching us. The rain began suddenly, fat droplets pelting the sidewalk as Eleanor and James hurried across Amsterdam Avenue. Eleanor glanced back despite her own warning and saw the elderly man from the reading room struggling to keep pace, his cane slipping on the wet pavement. He's following us, she hissed to James. James looked back. He's just an old man, Professor, who happens to be out in a downpour, following the exact route we're taking. They ducked into a coffee shop, taking a table by the window. The old man stopped outside, seemingly unconcerned by the rain soaking through his coat. He stared directly at them through the glass. Okay, that's creepy, James admitted. To their surprise, the man entered the shop, shaking water from his hat before approaching their table. Professor Walsh, he said, his voice stronger than his frail appearance suggested, and Mr. Chen. I believe you have questions about Robert Elias. Eleanor stiffened. How do you know our names, or what we're researching? The man smiled thinly. My name is Daniel Westbrook. I've been waiting for someone to find Pierce's journal for a very long time. Please sit down, Eleanor offered, curiosity overcoming caution. Westbrook lowered himself carefully into a chair. I was 8 years old in 1965 when my Uncle Robert disappeared. The family story was that he'd run off, abandoned his life, but I never believed it. Your uncle was Robert Elias? James asked incredulously. Yes, and I've spent most of my life trying to understand what happened to him. Westbrook pulled an envelope from his coat and removed several yellowed newspaper clippings. It's not just Robert and Pierce. There have been others. The clippings detailed strange disappearances across decades, people who vanished without explanation, often with witnesses describing odd atmospheric conditions. Some reappeared days, months, or even years later, with stories of having been in different times. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or delusions, Westbrook explained. But I've tracked 43 cases that follow the same pattern. Why are you telling us this? Eleanor asked. Because you found the photograph. You're looking for answers, just as I am. His eyes narrowed. And because the incidents are becoming more frequent. He spread out a map of Manhattan with locations marked in red. Each mark represents a disappearance or appearance. They're concentrated around certain areas. Eleanor studied the map. These are all major construction sites or areas of significant urban development. Precisely, Westbrook nodded. I believe whatever causes these displacements is triggered by substantial changes to the urban landscape, as if the fabric of time itself is disturbed by our reshaping of the physical environment. James looked skeptical. That sounds more like science fiction than science. Does it? Westbrook challenged. Quantum physics suggests time isn't as linear as we experience it. Einstein showed us that space and time are interconnected. What if certain physical disruptions create what amount to tears in that fabric? Eleanor's mind raced with the implications. If this is real, there should be a pattern to predict where and when these events might occur. I believe there is, Westbrook said grimly. And if I'm right, we're due for another incident very soon. There's major construction happening at the same intersection where Pierce photographed my uncle in 1861. As if on cue, the lights in the coffee shop flickered. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky had taken on an unnatural greenish tinge. We need to go there, Eleanor said, gathering her things. Now. Westbrook gripped her arm with surprising strength. Be careful, Professor. Not everyone who gets caught in these events survives them, and some who do are never the same again. Boom. As they left the coffee shop, none of them noticed the woman at the counter watching them intently, her modern clothing oddly contrasted by the antique locket around her neck. A locket containing a tiny daguerreotype of Jonathan Pierce. The construction site at the corner of Broadway and Worth Street was surrounded by the usual barriers and warning signs, but something about it felt off to Eleanor. The air seemed charged, almost vibrating with an energy she couldn't name. They're digging the foundation for a new skyscraper, Westbrook explained, as they observed from across the street. Directly on top of what was once the location of Pierce's photography studio. What exactly are we looking for? James asked, nervously eyeing the darkening sky. Anomalies, Westbrook replied. Atmospheric disturbances, visual inconsistencies, anything out of the ordinary. They found a small cafe with a view of the site and settled in to watch. Eleanor pulled out her laptop, cross-referencing Westbrook's map with historical records of construction in the city. If your theory is correct, Mr. Westbrook, there should have been similar incidents during other major construction periods in the city's history. There were, he confirmed, during the construction of the first subway lines, the Empire State Building, the World Trade Center. Each time reports of strange disappearances or appearances spiked. But why isn't this common knowledge? James asked. Westbrook's expression darkened. Because those who experience it are rarely believed, and because certain parties have an interest in keeping it quiet. What parties? Eleanor pressed. Before Westbrook could answer, a construction worker across the street suddenly stopped, staring at something only he could see. He reached out as if touching an invisible barrier, then stumbled back, dropping his tools. It's starting, Westbrook whispered. They rushed outside. The air around the construction site seemed to waver, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day, but more pronounced. A small crowd had gathered, pointing and filming with their phones. The worker was now backing away from an empty space, shouting for others to stay back. As Eleanor watched, the air seemed to tear open, not a visible rip, but a distortion in reality itself. And through that distortion stepped a woman in Victorian-era clothing, her face a mask of terror. "My God," Eleanor breathed. The woman looked around wildly, screaming when she saw the skyscrapers and traffic. Construction workers tried to approach her, but she backed away, her crinoline dress scraping against construction equipment. "We need to help her," Eleanor said, moving forward, but Westbrook held her back. "Wait," he warned. "The event isn't stable yet." As if confirming his words, the distortion wavered. The Victorian woman flickered like a bad television signal, then vanished with a sound like air rushing to fill a vacuum. Several onlookers gasped. "Where did she go?" James demanded. "Back, hopefully," Westbrook said, "or forward, or somewhere else entirely." The distortion was growing, expanding outward from the construction site. Traffic had stopped, drivers abandoning their vehicles to run from the phenomenon. "We should leave," James urged, but Eleanor stood transfixed. Within the distortion, she could now see glimpses of other times. Horse-drawn carriages overlaid with modern cars, buildings that existed and those long demolished, all occupying the same space. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's dangerous," Westbrook countered. "These events are unpredictable. Sometimes they last minutes, sometimes hours." As they watched, a modern businessman walked unknowingly into the affected area. One moment he was there, the next he had vanished, replaced by a confused-looking man in 1920s attire who materialized in his place. Police sirens wailed in the distance. The crowd had grown, people filming with their phones despite the danger. "We need to document this properly," Eleanor insisted, pulling out her own phone. "No!" Westbrook knocked the device from her hand. "They'll find you." "Who will find her?" James demanded. Before Westbrook could answer, men in unmarked black SUVs arrived, efficiently cordoning off the area and confiscating phones from the crowd. "Too late," Westbrook muttered. "They're here." "Who are they?" Eleanor asked, watching as the men set up equipment around the distortion. "They call themselves the Temporal Anomaly Containment Division, a secret government unit that's been monitoring these events since at least the 1940s. "Why contain them? Why not study them?" "Who says they don't?" Westbrook replied grimly. "But their primary concern is keeping the public unaware. Time displacement challenges everything we understand about physics. It would cause panic." One of the men in black spotted them and began moving in their direction, speaking into a radio clipped to his shoulder. "We need to leave, now," Westbrook urged. But Eleanor stood her ground. "No, I want answers." The man approached, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. "Dr. Eleanor Walsh? We need you to come with us." "How do you know my name?" Eleanor demanded. The man removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that held both authority and weariness. "Because we've been expecting you, Dr. Walsh, for a very long time." The SUV moved silently through Manhattan traffic, its government plates ensuring a clear path despite the evening rush hour. Eleanor sat rigid between James and Westbrook in the back seat, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. "Where are you taking us?" she finally asked the driver, a stone-faced woman who hadn't spoken since ushering them into the vehicle. "Headquarters," came the terse reply. The man who had approached them at the construction site, who had introduced himself only as Agent Michaels, sat in the passenger seat, reviewing something on a tablet. He seemed deliberately positioned to block their view of its screen. "You said you were expecting me," Eleanor pressed. "What did you mean by that?" Michaels turned slightly. "All will be explained, Dr. Walsh. Patience." They drove to a nondescript office building in Midtown, entering through an underground parking garage. The elevator required both a keycard and retinal scan from Michaels, descending far deeper than Eleanor would have expected possible in Manhattan's bedrock. The doors opened to reveal a bustling operations center that reminded Eleanor of NASA mission control. Rows of workstations with multiple monitors, a massive central display showing a map of New York with pulsing dots of various colors, and personnel moving with practiced efficiency. "Welcome to the Temporal Anomaly Containment Division," Michaels announced, leading them through the facility. Established in 1943 after multiple temporal displacements were observed during the construction of the Pentagon. A government agency dedicated to time anomalies, James muttered. Unbelievable. Believe it, a new voice interjected. They turned to see an elegant older woman approaching, her silver hair cropped short, her bearing military despite her civilian clothing. Director Chen, Michaels acknowledged with a nod. Director Chen, James repeated, looking startled. The woman smiled thinly. No relation, Mr. Chen, though your grandmother would have appreciated the coincidence. James frowned. How do you know about my grandmother? Because we've been monitoring your research, Dr. Walsh's investigations, and Mr. Westbrook's lifelong obsession, Director Chen replied matter-of-factly. Please follow me. She led them to a conference room with walls of screens showing data feeds and historical photographs, including the one of Robert Elias that had started Eleanor's journey. You've been watching us, Eleanor accused once the door closed behind them. Of course we have, Chen agreed without apology. Just as we monitor anyone who gets close to discovering the truth about temporal fractures. Fractures, Eleanor repeated. Not displacements. A more accurate term for what you witnessed today, Chen explained, activating a screen that showed footage of the construction site incident. The fabric of space-time occasionally develops tears, fractures, at points of significant physical change. Major construction, demolition, sometimes natural disasters. Why construction specifically? James asked. We have theories, Chen replied. The most compelling suggests that certain locations develop a kind of temporal resonance over time. When that physical space is dramatically altered, it can trigger a release of temporal energy. Westbrook, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke. You knew about my uncle. Chen's expression softened slightly. Yes, Mr. Westbrook. Robert Elias was one of the first documented cases of bidirectional displacement. He traveled to 1861, then returned to 1965, then disappeared again in what we believe was a third displacement. We've never located him in the historical record after that. And Pierce, the photographer, experienced a similar displacement in the opposite direction, appearing briefly in 1965 before returning to his own time, where he died shortly after. Eleanor struggled to process this information. Why tell us now? Why not continue your containment and secrecy? Chen sighed, suddenly looking her age. Because the fractures are increasing in frequency and intensity, today's event was the 4th this month, and our predictive models indicate something much larger is coming. She activated another screen showing a complex mathematical model. Even with Eleanor's limited understanding of theoretical physics, she could see the exponential curve. We believe we're approaching what our scientists call a cascade point, Chen continued, a moment when multiple fractures could occur simultaneously across the city, possibly worldwide. Causing what exactly? James asked. Mass displacements. Temporal refugees from throughout history suddenly appearing in our time, modern people vanishing into the past. Chaos. The room fell silent as they absorbed this information. Why tell us? Eleanor finally asked. What can we possibly do? Chen looked directly at her. Because, Dr. Walsh, you've already done it. She tapped a command into the table's integrated console, bringing up a new image on the main screen. A photograph from what appeared to be the 1970s, showing a TACD operations room not unlike the one they'd just walked through. And there, standing among a group of researchers, was an older version of Eleanor herself. Eleanor stared at the photograph, unable to process what she was seeing. The woman in the image was unmistakably her, older, with streaks of grey in her hair, but with the same eyes, the same slight asymmetry to her smile. That's impossible, she whispered. Is it? Chen challenged. After everything you've witnessed today? James leaned closer to the screen. When was this taken? June 17th, 1976, Chen replied. During what we now call the bicentennial incident, a major temporal fracture that occurred during preparations for the nation's 200th anniversary celebrations. I would have been, Eleanor calculated quickly. You hadn't been born yet, Chen confirmed. And yet there you are. Westbrook had moved to examine the photo more closely. Who are the others in the image? TACD personnel and consultants brought in to help manage the incident. Chen pointed to a bearded man standing beside Eleanor's doppelganger, including this gentleman who identified himself as James Chen. James took an involuntary step back. That's not possible. Time isn't linear, Westbrook murmured. It's a loop. Chen nodded approvingly. Very good, Mr. Westbrook. Our current working theory is that temporal fractures create closed causal loops, what some would call predestination paradoxes. You're saying we're destined to travel back to 1976? Eleanor asked incredulously. I'm saying you already have, Chen corrected. From our perspective, it's history. From yours, it's still future. Eleanor felt dizzy with the implications. But if we know about it now, couldn't we choose not to go? Break the loop? Many have tried, Chen said grimly. None have succeeded. The universe seems to have mechanisms to preserve causality. This is insane, James protested. You can't possibly expect us to believe. Your skepticism is noted, Mr. Chen, Michaels interrupted, but irrelevant. The photograph exists. Your future involvement is historical fact. Eleanor struggled to organize her thoughts. If what you're saying is true, then why tell us at all? Why not just wait for whatever causes us to travel back in time? Because you did more than just appear in 1976, Chen explained. According to our records, you arrived with critical information that helped contain the bicentennial incident. Information you haven't acquired yet. She activated another screen, displaying pages of complex equations and diagrams. This is the temporal resonance theory, a mathematical model that predicts temporal fractures with 94% accuracy. It revolutionized our understanding and management of these events. Chen paused significantly. It was developed by Dr. Eleanor Walsh and James Chen in 1976. Eleanor and James exchanged stunned looks. But we don't know anything about temporal physics, James objected. Not yet, Chen agreed. That's why we're bringing you into TACD now. You need to learn everything we know about temporal fractures before you travel back and teach it to us in the past. Westbrook had been silent, studying the documents on the screen. Now he spoke, his voice tense. There's something you're not telling them. Chen's expression tightened. Mr. Westbrook, the cascade, he pressed. Tell them what really happens. A heavy silence fell over the room. What is he talking about? Eleanor demanded. Chen sighed deeply. The predictive models I showed you earlier weren't complete. The full projection indicates that the coming cascade won't just cause temporary fractures. It could create permanent tears in the fabric of space-time, irreparable damage to the structure of reality itself. Meaning what exactly? James asked. Meaning the end of stable temporal progression, Michaels answered bluntly. Past, present and future collapsing into a chaotic tangle of overlapping time frames. The effective end of human civilization as we understand it. Eleanor felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. And you think we can prevent this? You already have, Chen said simply. In 1976, you and Mr. Chen provided us with the foundation for technology that could not only predict fractures, but potentially seal them permanently. The temporal resonance dampers, Westbrook added. I found references to them in declassified documents from the 80s. Chen shot him a look of grudging respect. You've been thorough, Mr. Westbrook. Yes, the TRDs were developed based on your work, Dr. Walsh. But the prototypes were unstable, and the program was eventually abandoned. Until now, Michaels added. We've restarted the program using advanced materials and computational power that didn't exist in the 70s, Chen explained. But we're missing key theoretical insights that historically came from you. Eleanor struggled to process the circular logic. So you need us to go back in time and give you information that you'll then give to us in the present, so we can go back and give it to you in the past. Welcome to temporal physics, Dr. Walsh, Chen said with the first genuine smile they'd seen from her. Where effect sometimes precedes cause. Outside the conference room, alarms suddenly blared. The door burst open as a technician rushed in. Director, we've got another fracture forming, bigger than anything we've recorded. Chen was immediately on her feet. Location, Central Park, and it's expanding rapidly. Chen turned to Eleanor and James, her expression grave. It seems the universe isn't giving you much time to prepare. The cascade may be beginning. What do we do? Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her own calm. We go to Central Park, Chen replied, and you start learning very, very quickly. Central Park had been evacuated, a perimeter established by TACD agents posing as Homeland Security. From the command vehicle parked at the edge of Sheep Meadow, Eleanor watched the monitors showing live feeds from drones circling above the park. The fracture was visible even to the naked eye, a shimmering distortion in the air that warped the landscape behind it, like looking through a heat haze, but more pronounced. It had started small, according to the initial reports, but now spanned nearly 50 yards and was growing. It's beautiful, James murmured, watching the display. And deadly, Michaels added grimly. We've already lost 2 agents who got too close. Lost how? Eleanor asked. Displaced, Chen explained, joining them at the monitors. Temporal readings suggest they've been shifted approximately 200 years into the past. Can you bring them back? Chen's silence was answer enough. Technicians moved efficiently around them, setting up equipment that Eleanor now recognized as more advanced versions of the devices shown in the 1976 photograph, temporal resonance dampers, or at least their modern equivalents. These won't close the fracture, Chen explained, noticing Eleanor's interest, but they might stabilize it temporarily, prevent it from expanding further. And if they don't, James asked, then Manhattan experiences a temporal event unlike anything in recorded history. Westbrook had been permitted to join them, though he was clearly being watched by TACD personnel. Now he approached, pointing to one of the monitors. Look at the center of the fracture. Eleanor squinted at the screen. Within the distortion, shadowy figures moved, people from different times momentarily visible before vanishing again, like ghosts trapped between worlds. Those are potential displacements, Chen explained. People who might be pulled through if the fracture fully stabilizes in their time frame. Can they see us? Eleanor wondered aloud. Some can, Westbrook answered before Chen could. My uncle described seeing shadows of the future before he was pulled through. A technician called out from a monitoring station. Director, temporal fluctuations are increasing. Resonance patterns indicate a potential collapse point in 12 minutes. Collapse? James echoed. The moment when the fracture either stabilizes, allowing full displacement between time frames, or seals itself naturally, Chen explained. We're hoping for the latter. And if it stabilizes, Eleanor asked, then we could see hundreds, potentially thousands of people from different eras suddenly appearing in modern Manhattan, Michaels responded. And an equal number from our time disappearing. Another alarm sounded. On the monitors, the fracture pulsed, expanding another 10 feet in all directions. The dampers aren't working, a technician called out. Increase power to all units, Chen ordered. Prepare containment protocols. Eleanor watched the frantic activity, feeling strangely detached. Something about the fracture seemed almost familiar, as if she'd seen it before. A memory tickled at the edges of her consciousness. I need to see it directly, she said suddenly. Chen turned sharply. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. You said yourself that I'm crucial to solving this, that I've already done it. Eleanor met the director's gaze steadily. What if this moment, this decision, is part of how that happens? Chen hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the paradoxical logic of their situation. I'll go with her, James volunteered. And me. Westbrook added. After a moment's consideration, Chen nodded curtly. 5 minutes, no closer than the perimeter markers. Agent Michaels will accompany you. They exited the command vehicle, walking toward the edge of Sheep Meadow, where the fracture shimmered in the late afternoon light. The air felt charged, as if a thunderstorm were approaching, though the sky remained clear. Temporal static, Michaels explained, when Eleanor commented on the sensation. Side effect of the fracture disrupting normal chronological flow. As they drew closer, Eleanor could hear it, a strange atonal humming that seemed to vibrate through her bones rather than reach her through her ears. The sound triggered something in her memory, a connection she couldn't quite place. The resonance pattern, she murmured, stopping at the perimeter marker. It's not random. James looked at her curiously. What do you mean? The fluctuations. They're following a mathematical sequence. Eleanor stared into the shimmering distortion, her mind racing. James, do you remember the Fibonacci spiral we modeled for that architecture project last year? Of course, but what does that have to... He broke off, following her gaze. Oh my God, you're right, the expansion pattern. It's following a natural growth sequence, Eleanor confirmed. Which means it's predictable. She turned to Michaels. I need paper, something to write with. The agent hesitated, then handed her a small notebook and pen from his pocket. Eleanor began scribbling equations frantically, trying to capture the pattern she could somehow see in the fracture's movements. If the resonance follows this sequence, then the counter-resonance needed to dampen it would be... James looked over her shoulder, catching on to her thought process. An inverse Fibonacci ratio applied to the damper frequencies. Exactly. Eleanor turned to Michaels. We need to get back to the command center. I think I know how to stabilize the fracture. As they turned to leave, the ground beneath them suddenly lurched. The fracture pulsed violently, expanding toward them with frightening speed. Run! Michaels shouted, pushing them ahead of him. They sprinted toward the command vehicle, the air behind them crackling with temporal energy. Eleanor clutched the notebook, refusing to let go even as she ran. A strange sensation washed over her, like falling while standing still, her perception stretching and compressing simultaneously. She heard James cry out beside her, felt Westbrook stumble against her shoulder. Then everything went white. When her vision cleared, Eleanor was still standing at the edge of Sheep Meadow, but the command vehicle was gone. The TACD perimeter had vanished, and the New York skyline, visible beyond the trees, had transformed dramatically, buildings missing, others appearing in their place, the glass and steel of modern skyscrapers replaced by older architectural styles. "James?" she called out, her voice sounding strangely muffled. "Westbrook? I'm here," James responded, his face pale with shock as he looked around. "But when is here?" Westbrook stood a few feet away, his expression not of confusion, but of grim acceptance. "If I had to guess," he said quietly, "sometime in the 1970s. In the distance, sirens wailed, and approaching across the meadow was a group of people in outdated clothing, led by a young woman with a familiar face, Director Chen, decades younger but unmistakable. "It seems," Eleanor said, clutching the notebook of equations that would one day lead to their present predicament, "that we have an appointment with history." The TACD of 1976 operated out of a converted warehouse in Lower Manhattan, a far cry from the sleek underground facility of 2025. As Eleanor, James, and Westbrook were escorted through the building, they noted the analog technology, the banks of reel-to-reel computers, the cigarette smoke hanging in the air, all jarring reminders of their displacement. They had been brought directly to the facility after being intercepted in Central Park, subjected to medical examinations and preliminary questioning, before being led to a conference room not unlike the one they'd sat in hours earlier and decades later. "You realize how this sounds?" said the man who had introduced himself as Deputy Director Morrison, a bulky figure with sideburns and a polyester suit that screamed 1970s. 3 people claiming to be from 2025, appearing out of nowhere during a temporal event. Yet you brought us here instead of committing us to a psychiatric facility, Eleanor pointed out, which suggests you're at least considering the possibility we're telling the truth. Morrison exchanged glances with the younger Chen, who stood by the door with her arms crossed. We've dealt with temporal displacement before, Chen admitted, though never anyone claiming to be from so far in the future. You can verify our identities, James suggested. I was born in 1992, Eleanor in 1990. Our DNA should match any samples you collect from our families in this time period. Already in progress, Morrison confirmed, though it will take time. Westbrook had remained mostly silent, his eyes taking in every detail of the facility. Now he spoke. You're preparing for something. The bicentennial celebrations. Chen's posture stiffened. How do you know that? Because in our time, it's called the bicentennial incident, Eleanor explained, a major temporal fracture that occurs during the preparations for the nation's 200th anniversary. Morrison leaned forward. You're saying you know what's going to happen. We know that a significant temporal event occurs, James clarified. And according to TACD records in 2025, we played a role in helping contain it. Predestination paradox, Chen murmured. If what you're saying is true, Eleanor placed the notebook on the table. These are the equations I began developing when we encountered the fracture in Central Park in our time. They describe a mathematical model for predicting and potentially controlling temporal resonance. Morrison picked up the notebook skeptically, flipping through the hastily scrawled formulas. His expression changed gradually from doubt to intrigue. This builds on Cartwright's temporal field theory, he said, sounding surprised, but takes it in directions we hadn't considered. In 2025, this becomes the foundation of temporal resonance theory, Eleanor explained, the mathematical framework that allows TACD to predict fractures with 94% accuracy. Chen had moved closer, studying the equations over Morrison's shoulder. Some of these variables, they're addressing quantum-level temporal fluctuations we've only just begun to measure. Because in our time, the technology exists to detect them more precisely, James explained. Morrison closed the notebook, his expression guarded, but no longer entirely skeptical. Let's assume for the moment that you are who you claim to be. What exactly happens during this bicentennial incident? Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. We weren't given all the details, but we know it involves a major temporal fracture in Manhattan during the July 4th celebrations, one that could potentially displace hundreds of people from different time frames, if not contained. And you know how to contain it? Chen asked. Not exactly, Eleanor admitted, but the equations in that notebook are apparently the starting point. Morrison and Chen exchanged another look, some unspoken communication passing between them. There's something you're not telling us, Westbrook observed quietly. Morrison sighed, stubbing out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. We've been detecting temporal anomalies throughout the city for the past 3 months, small ones, barely noticeable, but increasing in frequency and intensity. Our models predict a significant event during the harbor celebrations on July 4th, Chen added, but we've been unable to pinpoint the exact location or develop an effective containment strategy. The harbor, James repeated, something clicking in his memory. Operation Sail, the tall ships. You know about that? Morrison asked sharply. It's history to us, Eleanor reminded him. The bicentennial celebration included a parade of tall ships from around the world in New York Harbor. And according to our projections, somewhere in that harbor, during that parade, a temporal fracture will form, Chen confirmed, potentially the largest we've ever recorded. Westbrook, who had been pacing slowly around the conference room, stopped suddenly. The Hudson River is a focal point for temporal energy. All eyes turned to him. In 2025, the fracture formed in Central Park, he continued. But historically, many documented displacements have occurred near bodies of water in Manhattan, particularly the Hudson, including my uncle's. The harbor parade concentrates hundreds of vessels on the water. Morrison mused. Millions of spectators. If a major fracture occurs, it would be catastrophic, Eleanor finished. Not just the displacements themselves, but the panic they would cause. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young technician entered, handing Chen a folder before quickly departing. She reviewed its contents, her expression shifting from skepticism to astonishment. Preliminary DNA results, she announced. They're consistent with your claims. Mr. Chen's genetic markers align with samples we collected from the Chen family in Queens. And Dr. Walsh, she looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes. Your DNA shows familial markers consistent with the Walsh family of Boston. Morrison looked between them, making a decision. Let's continue this discussion elsewhere. There's something you need to see. He led them through the facility to a secure room dominated by a large map of Manhattan, covered in pins and markers of various colors. Each pin represents a documented temporal anomaly over the past 50 years, he explained. Blue for appearances, red for disappearances, yellow for recorded visual distortions without confirmed displacement. Eleanor studied the pattern, immediately noticing the concentration around the Hudson River and harbor areas. The distribution follows a pattern. We've noticed, Chen said dryly, but haven't been able to determine its significance. James approached the map, tracing the arrangement of pins with his finger. It's not random. It looks almost like a wave pattern, Westbrook finished, emanating from a central point. Eleanor's mind raced, connecting this new information with the equations she'd begun developing. The fractures aren't isolated incidents. They're ripples from a single event, one that hasn't happened yet. The bicentennial incident, Morrison murmured. No, Eleanor shook her head. Something bigger. In our time, TACD called it the cascade, a critical mass of temporal fractures occurring simultaneously. And you think this cascade is what sent you back to our time? Chen asked. I think the fracture that formed in Central Park in 2025 was connected to the one that's going to form in the harbor in 1976, Eleanor explained, her thoughts crystallizing as she spoke. Not separate events, but points on a continuum, nodes in a temporal wave that spans decades. Which means, James added, catching her train of thought, that containing the fracture here in 1976 could potentially prevent or mitigate the cascade in 2025. Morrison looked skeptical again. That's quite a leap, but it aligns with our observations, Chen pointed out. The increasing frequency of anomalies, the wave pattern. We need to develop the temporal resonance dampers, Eleanor said firmly, using the equations in my notebook as a starting point. Dampers? Morrison questioned. Devices that generate a counter-resonance to stabilize temporal fractures, James explained. In our time, TACD had prototype versions, but they weren't fully effective. Because they were missing key theoretical components, Eleanor added. Components that, apparently, we're meant to provide now. The circular logic of their situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Eleanor could see Morrison struggling with it, while Chen seemed more accepting of the paradox. How much time do we have? Westbrook asked, breaking the thoughtful silence. 11 days until July 4th, Morrison answered. Eleanor looked at the map again, at the pattern of temporal disturbances spanning decades of New York's history. Then she turned to face the others, her decision made. Then we have 11 days to rewrite temporal physics and build technology that doesn't exist yet, she said, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Let's get started. Drill. The TACD laboratory of 1976 was primitive by 2025 standards, but Eleanor and James quickly adapted to working with the available technology. For 7 days, they barely left the facility, sleeping on cots brought into the lab when exhaustion overtook them. Eleanor's notebook had become the foundation for their work. Its equations expanded across chalkboards and reams of computer printouts. James focused on the practical applications, working with TACD engineers to design prototype dampers based on Eleanor's theoretical framework. Westbrook had found his own role, combing through TACD's historical records of temporal displacements, looking for patterns or clues they might have missed. His personal connection to the phenomenon through his uncle Robert Elias gave him insights the others lacked. 4 days left, Chen announced, entering the lab with fresh coffee for the team. In the week they'd been working together, she'd shed much of her initial skepticism, becoming their strongest advocate within the organization. Eleanor rubbed her eyes, staring at the latest simulation results. The resonance model is holding, but the damper designs aren't generating a strong enough counter-frequency. We need more power, James said, not for the first time. The technology just isn't advanced enough. Then we need to find a workaround, Chen replied pragmatically. What about multiple dampers positioned at strategic locations? James considered this. It could work. A network of smaller fields might be more stable than a single large one. We'd need to calculate the optimal positioning. Eleanor mused, already turning to a fresh chalkboard. If the fracture follows the pattern we're predicting. The door opened again, admitting Morrison with a grim expression. We've got a problem. Another anomaly just formed in Brooklyn, bigger than anything we've recorded so far. Brooklyn, Eleanor frowned. That doesn't fit the pattern. Unless the pattern is changing, Westbrook suggested, looking up from his research. Accelerating. We need to see it, James decided. An hour later, they stood at the edge of Brooklyn Heights Promenade, looking out over the East River toward Manhattan. The anomaly was visible as a shimmering distortion in the air above the water, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. It formed 20 minutes ago, Morrison explained. No confirmed displacements yet, but we've evacuated the area as a precaution. Eleanor studied the phenomenon, noting its behavior. The resonance is different from what we saw in Central Park. Different how? Chen asked. More stable, less expansion. Eleanor circled the perimeter slowly, observing from different angles. It's almost as if it's waiting for something, Westbrook finished her thought. James had been setting up measuring equipment borrowed from the lab. Now he called out, I'm getting unusual readings, temporal fluctuations, but with a regular pattern. Like a pulse, Eleanor asked, moving to join him. Exactly like a pulse, every 7.3 seconds. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the June breeze. That's not random. That's a signal. Morrison looked alarmed. Are you suggesting this anomaly is intelligent? Not intelligent, Eleanor clarified. Directed. Something or someone is trying to stabilize this fracture intentionally. From which side? Chen asked the question they were all thinking. Before anyone could answer, the anomaly pulsed more brightly than before. Within its shimmering depths, a silhouette became visible, a human figure appearing to walk through the distortion as if through a doorway. Containment protocols, Morrison barked into his radio, but Eleanor held up a hand. Wait, look at how it's moving. That's not a random displacement. Ew. The figure emerged fully from the anomaly, a man in his 60s, dressed in clothing that seemed oddly timeless. He stood calmly at the edge of the promenade, looking directly at their group with an expression of profound relief. Dr. Walsh, he called out, you made it. Eleanor stepped forward cautiously. Do I know you? The man smiled sadly. Not yet, but you will. He glanced at the others. Mr. Chen, Mr. Westbrook, Director Morrison, Agent Chen, I'm glad to see the historical records were accurate. Who are you? Morrison demanded, his hand moving toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. My name is Dr. Thomas Elliot. I'm from 2047. He gestured toward the anomaly behind him, which was already beginning to fade. And I'm here to prevent the end of the world. Back at the TACD facility, Elliot sat calmly in the interrogation room, submitting to medical examinations and identity verification procedures with patient cooperation. His technology is decades ahead of ours, Chen reported, returning from observing the examination. The device on his wrist appears to be what generated and stabilized the anomaly. Our scientists can't even begin to understand how it works. But you believe he's genuinely from 2047? Eleanor asked. The evidence supports his claim, Chen confirmed. Cellular analysis shows aging patterns consistent with advanced medical intervention not currently available. And there are trace elements in his blood that our chemists can't identify. Morrison, who had been silently brooding, finally spoke. If he's telling the truth, why come back? Why not just send information, like the notebook you brought? Perhaps because the stakes are higher than we realized, Westbrook suggested quietly. They were permitted to speak with Elliot shortly after, finding him drinking tea and looking remarkably composed for a man who had just traveled 71 years into the past. The temporal mechanics of information transfer are tricky, he explained in response to Morrison's question. Physical objects, like Dr. Walsh's notebook, can sometimes make the journey intact, but complex information degrades. I needed to be here in person to ensure nothing was lost. Lost of what? Eleanor asked. Elliot set down his cup. The complete temporal resonance theory and the designs for functional resonance dampers. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small device no larger than a matchbox. This is a quantum storage unit containing everything you need. James eyed the device skeptically. Our computers won't be able to read that. I've accounted for that, Elliot assured him. The files are formatted for your technology, though you'll find them quite dense. Why now? Chen asked. Why not come directly to July 4th, when the fracture is predicted to form? Elliot's expression grew more serious. Because what happens on July 4th, 1976 is not isolated. It's connected to events in 2025, and to an even more catastrophic event in my time. We now understand that temporal fractures don't just link 2 points in time, they create resonance chains that can span centuries. The cascade, Eleanor murmured. Yes, Elliot confirmed. In my timeline, the bicentennial incident was improperly contained, creating a temporal instability that grew over decades. By 2025, it manifested as the cascade event that brought you here. And by 2047, it had evolved into what we call the collapse, a complete breakdown of stable temporal progression. The end of the world, Westbrook echoed Elliot's earlier words. The end of reality as we understand it, Elliot corrected. Imagine past, present, and future existing simultaneously, overlapping, conflicting, constantly shifting. Civilization cannot function when the basic laws of cause and effect no longer apply. Eleanor tried to process the enormity of what he was describing. And you believe we can prevent this? I know you can, Elliot said with conviction. Because in an alternate timeline, you did. Alternate timeline? Morrison repeated skeptically. The multiverse theory is correct, Director, Elliot explained patiently. There exist parallel realities where events unfold differently. In one such reality, the team in this room successfully contained the bicentennial incident, preventing the chain of events leading to the collapse. How do you know this? James asked. Because before our reality began to unravel completely, we detected temporal communications from that alternate timeline. Warnings, instructions, fragments of successful containment strategies. Elliot gestured to the quantum storage device. I've spent my life compiling and completing that information, and now I'm here to deliver it, to ensure that this reality follows the successful path. A heavy silence fell over the room as they absorbed the implications of Elliot's story. 3 days, Eleanor finally said. We have 3 days until July 4th. Elliot nodded grimly. 3 days to rewrite the future. Dawn broke over New York Harbor on July 4th, 1976, the sun rising on a city transformed by celebration. Red, white, and blue decorations adorned buildings and streets, crowds already gathering along the waterfront despite the early hour. Operation Sail was scheduled to begin at 11 a.m., with tall ships from around the world parading into the harbor past the newly renovated Statue of Liberty. Unknown to the millions of spectators, TACD teams had worked through the night, positioning temporal resonance dampers at strategic locations throughout the harbor area. Based on Elliot's information and Eleanor's refined calculations, they had identified the most likely location for the fracture, a point in the harbor directly between the Statue of Liberty and Governor's Island. "Final equipment check complete," James reported, returning to the command center TACD had established in a Coast Guard facility on Governor's Island. "All dampers are online and responding." Eleanor nodded, too focused on the monitoring equipment to look up. The past 3 days had been a blur of activity, analyzing Elliot's data, recalibrating their models, constructing and positioning the dampers. They had worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and the knowledge of what failure would mean. "Temporal readings are stable so far," she noted. "No sign of pre-fracture resonance." "That could change quickly," Elliot warned. He'd spent much of the past 3 days in debriefing with TCD leadership, explaining the long-term implications of their work. Now he stood by the window, watching the harbor fill with vessels of all sizes. "According to my records, the fracture forms at approximately 11:47 a.m., just as the lead ship passes Liberty Island." Morrison entered, accompanied by Chen and Westbrook. "Coast Guard and Harbor Police are on standby. They think we're monitoring for conventional terrorism threats." "In a way, we are," Chen remarked dryly. Westbrook moved to stand beside Eleanor, studying the monitoring equipment. Over the past 10 days, he had become an integral part of their team, his intuitive understanding of temporal phenomena sometimes exceeding even Eleanor's theoretical knowledge. "Something feels wrong," he said quietly. Eleanor looked up. "The readings are normal." "Not the readings, the situation." Westbrook frowned. "It's too neat. Everything falling into place exactly as Elliot described." "Isn't that good?" James asked, overhearing. "Temporal mechanics don't usually work that way," Westbrook replied. "There's always variance, chaos factors, especially when dealing with predestination paradoxes." Eleanor considered this. She had come to trust Westbrook's instincts. "What are you suggesting?" Before he could answer, one of the monitoring stations began emitting a high-pitched alert. "Temporal fluctuations detected," the technician announced, "but not at the predicted coordinates." "Where?" Morrison demanded. "Multiple locations, small readings, scattered throughout the harbor area." Eleanor moved quickly to the station, examining the data herself. "These aren't pre-fracture signatures, they're more like echoes." "Reflections," Elliot corrected, joining them. "The main fracture hasn't formed yet, but its temporal influence is already propagating through time, creating minor disturbances." "That wasn't in your briefing," Morrison pointed out, a note of suspicion in his voice. "An oversight," Elliot said smoothly. "The historical records weren't complete in every detail." Westbrook and Eleanor exchanged glances, the same doubt reflected in both their expressions. Outside, the celebration continued unaware, the harbor now filled with vessels from pleasure craft to military ships. The lead tall ship had just come into view, its white sails billowing in the morning breeze. 40 minutes to projected fracture formation," Chen announced. James had moved to another monitoring station. "The damper network is stable, but these echo readings are causing interference. We might need to adjust the resonance frequencies." "No," Elliot said sharply. "The settings are calibrated precisely. Changing them could destabilize the entire network." "But if the echo pattern continues to intensify," James began. "It won't," Elliot interrupted. "Trust me, Mr. Chen. I've lived through this day before in simulations and historical analysis. I know what happens." The certainty in his voice might have been reassuring, but something about it raised Eleanor's suspicions further. She moved to a terminal and began quietly running a separate analysis of the temporal data, one that wouldn't appear on the main monitoring systems. The next 30 minutes passed in tense anticipation, the echo readings fluctuating but never disappearing completely. Outside, the tall ships continued their stately progress through the harbour, watched by millions of spectators both in person and on television broadcasts around the world. 15 minutes to projected fracture formation, Chen announced. Eleanor's private analysis had completed. She studied the results for a long moment, then motioned subtly for Westbrook to join her. When he did, she angled the screen so only he could see it. "The echo pattern," she whispered. "It's not random. It's forming a perimeter." Westbrook's eyes widened as he understood. A containment field. But containing what? Not what, Eleanor realized with sudden clarity. Who? She looked across the room at Elliot, who stood watching the harbour with an expression of intense anticipation. "He's not here to prevent the fracture. He's here to ensure it happens." Westbrook nodded slowly. "And to make sure we don't interfere. We need to talk to Morrison and Chen without alerting Elliot," Eleanor murmured. "Leave it to me," Westbrook replied. He moved casually toward the back of the room, where Morrison and Chen were conferring, deliberately circling away from Elliot's line of sight. Eleanor watched as he engaged them in conversation, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern as he spoke. Morrison's eyes flicked briefly to Elliot, then back to Westbrook, giving a nearly imperceptible nod. He turned to a nearby technician, issuing a quiet order that sent the young man hurrying from the room. James, noticing the subtle tension, moved to join Eleanor. "What's happening?" he whispered. "I think we've been misled," she replied softly. "The dampers aren't positioned to contain a fracture. They're positioned to create one." James looked stunned. "But why would Elliot—" 10 minutes to projected fracture formation," Chen announced, her voice carefully neutral despite now being aware of their suspicions. Elliot checked his wrist device, the same one he'd used to generate the anomaly in Brooklyn. "Right on schedule," he murmured, seemingly to himself. The door opened as security personnel quietly entered, positioning themselves around the room on Morrison's signal. The director approached Elliot with deliberate casualness. "Dr. Elliot, I'd like to review the final containment protocols." "Of course," Elliot replied smoothly, turning away from the window. It was the opening Eleanor needed. She quickly reconfigured the monitoring system, overriding the settings that had been programmed based on Elliot's specifications. James, catching on immediately, began adjusting the damper network controls. "Stop them!" Elliot suddenly shouted, lunging toward the control station. The security personnel moved instantly, restraining him before he could reach Eleanor and James. "What is the meaning of this?" Elliot demanded, struggling against their hold. "That's what we'd like to know," Morrison replied coldly. "Dr. Walsh has discovered that your damper configuration would amplify the temporal fracture, not contain it." Elliot's expression shifted from outrage to calculating calm. "You don't understand what's at stake. The fracture must form. It's the only way to prevent a worse catastrophe." "What catastrophe?" Chen demanded. "The collapse still happens in your timeline, doesn't it?" Eleanor realized aloud. "But not because the bicentennial incident was improperly contained, because it was contained at all." A smile spread slowly across Elliot's face. No longer the benevolent scientist, but something colder and more fanatical. "Very good, Dr. Walsh. Yes, the collapse is inevitable in any timeline where temporal progression remains linear. The only way to prevent it is to embrace the fracture, to allow past, present, and future to merge." "That would cause chaos," James protested. "Initially, yes," Elliot acknowledged, "but eventually a new equilibrium would form. A reality where time is fluid, where humanity is freed from the tyranny of chronological progression." "You're insane," Morrison stated flatly. "I'm enlightened," Elliot corrected. "In my time, we've learned to navigate the fluid time stream. We've evolved beyond your limited perceptions." "Nay, 5 minutes to projected fracture formation," a technician called out, unaware of the confrontation taking place. "It's too late to stop it anyway," Elliot said with satisfaction. "The resonance pattern is already established. The fracture will form with or without the dampers." "Then we'll contain it without them," Eleanor declared. finalizing her adjustments to the system. "James, initiate the emergency shutdown of all damper units." "No!" Elliot shouted, renewing his struggle against the security personnel. As James executed the command, Elliot managed to free one arm, activating his wrist device. A blinding flash filled the room, momentarily disorienting everyone. When Eleanor's vision cleared, she saw that Elliot had broken free and was now holding what looked like a small, remote detonator. "The dampers have secondary power systems," he announced, "and they're now programmed to overload on my command, creating a forced resonance that will tear open the fabric of space-time across the entire harbor." Outside, the lead tall ship was passing Liberty Island, right on schedule. 2 minutes to projected fracture formation, the technician reported nervously. Morrison signaled the security team to stand down, not wanting to provoke Elliot into triggering the detonator. "Think about what you're doing. Millions of people could be displaced, killed in the chaos. A necessary sacrifice for the evolution of humanity," Elliot replied coldly. Eleanor's mind raced, searching for a solution. The dampers couldn't be shut down remotely now, and they couldn't risk Elliot triggering an overload. Then she remembered something Westbrook had said days earlier. Temporal mechanics don't usually work that way. There's always variance, chaos factors. "James," she said quietly, "the echo readings, they're forming a pattern that could be inverted." James caught her meaning immediately. "A counter-resonance using the echoes themselves." "Exactly. If we can amplify the echo pattern while reversing its phase, we could neutralize the fracture before it fully forms," James finished. 1 minute to projected fracture formation, came the announcement. Eleanor and James worked frantically at the controls, reconfiguring the monitoring equipment to emit a signal that would interact with the temporal echoes, creating a naturally occurring counter-resonance. "It won't be enough," Elliot scoffed, watching their efforts. "The resonance is too strong." "Maybe for your technology," Eleanor replied without looking up, "but you forgot something important about 1976. "And what's that?" Elliot asked contemptuously. Westbrook answered for her. "It's the bicentennial. Every radio and television station in the country is broadcasting at full power, saturating the airwaves. Electromagnetic radiation interacts with temporal fields," James added. "We're going to use the broadcast signals to amplify our counter-resonance." Elliot's confident expression faltered for the first time. "That won't work." 30 seconds to projected fracture formation, the technician called. "It's ready," Eleanor announced. "Activate the signal on my mark." "You'll doom humanity to extinction," Elliot shouted, raising the detonator. Before he could press it, Westbrook launched himself across the room, tackling Elliot to the floor. The detonator skittered away, coming to rest at Chen's feet. She quickly retrieved it, disabling it with practiced efficiency. "Fracture forming!" the technician shouted as alarms blared throughout the facility. Through the windows, they could see it, a shimmering distortion in the air above the harbor, directly between Liberty Island and their position on Governor's Island. It pulsed once, twice, expanding rapidly. "Now, James," Eleanor commanded. James activated their improvised counter-resonance. For a terrifying moment, nothing seemed to happen. The fracture continued to grow, now large enough to be visible to the spectators, who pointed and shouted in confusion and alarm. Then, gradually, the distortion began to waver, its edges becoming less defined. The monitoring equipment showed the counter-resonance taking effect, the combined power of their signal and the nationwide broadcasts, creating an electromagnetic field that disrupted the temporal resonance pattern. "It's working," James breathed. The fracture pulsed one final time, then collapsed in on itself, vanishing with a sound like distant thunder that rolled across the harbor. Elliot, still pinned beneath Westbrook, let out a howl of rage and despair. "You fools! You've doomed us all!" Morrison nodded to the security team, who took Elliot into custody. "Get him to a secure holding facility. I want everything he brought with him analyzed." As Elliot was led away, still ranting about the inevitability of the collapse, Eleanor turned to James and Westbrook. "We did it," she said simply. "For now," Westbrook cautioned, "but what about 2025, the cascade that sent us here in the first place?" "I think we just prevented it," Eleanor replied. "By containing this fracture properly, we've broken the resonance chain that would have led to the cascade. Which means we've potentially changed our own timeline," James realized. "We might return to a 2025, very different from the one we left. If we return at all," Westbrook added quietly. Outside, the celebration continued, the spectators already dismissing the strange atmospheric phenomenon they'd witnessed as an unusual cloud formation or a trick of the light. The tall ships continued their parade, sails billowing proudly in the summer breeze, unaware of how close they had come to sailing into a temporal abyss. Eleanor watched them, wondering what the future, their future, now held. Had they succeeded in preventing the cascade? Would they find a way back to their own time? And if they did, what would they find there? As if reading her thoughts, Chen joined them at the window. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Eleanor looked at the harbor, at the city beyond, at the millions of people continuing their lives in blissful ignorance of how close they had come to chaos. "Now," she said, "we wait to see what timeline we've created." In the distance, fireworks began to explode over the harbor, celebrating America's bicentennial and unknowingly marking a pivot point in the history of reality itself.